from Maryland.
Mr. President, let me thank my colleague from Connecticut for his words in support of the Equal Rights Amendment and for his fight for justice. And let me also thank my colleague, my Maryland partner and friend, Senator Cardin, for teaming up with Senator Murkowski to push for passage of this legislation year after year. It's long overdue that we take this up and that we pass it in the United States Senate. If you look at our history, during the darkest of times and against the longest of odds, Americans from all backgrounds have stood together to insist that America live up to its promise. The promise of equality, the promise of equal rights for all. In fact, if you think about the story of America, it really is the story of the struggle to make good on that fundamental promise, to ensure that every individual receives equal dignity. We talk about how we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that's true. They're not more rights for men. They're not supposed to be more rights for any particular group. It's supposed to be about equal dignity. And equal dignity should include equal treatment under the law. Now, in their fight for voting rights, our nation's suffragettes faced unjust arrest, they faced persecution, they faced resistance from a nation that was not yet willing to fulfill that full promise when it came to voting rights. And despite it all, through protests, through demands, through arrests, the suffragettes prevailed and made sure that we passed the 19th Amendment, at least fulfilling the right to vote for women. But we have a lot of unfinished business. You know, it's not just all men who were created equal, it's all people who were created equal. We have accomplished that when it comes to the ballot box, although as we in this body know, we also have a long way to go to make sure that that is made real in practice on the ground. That's why we've been fighting to pass voting rights legislation. But we also need to make sure that when it comes to women's rights, we enshrine it in the highest law of the land in order to give the rhetoric legal teeth and legal backing. Alice Paul, who really is the founder of the movement for the Equal Rights Amendment, knew that a century ago when she said, and I quote, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated. But to me," she said, "there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." And there is great truth in the simplicity of that statement. And that's what the Equal Rights is all about. It's not a lot of words, but they're the rightly chosen words. Quote, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." End quote. That's it. A simple statement, but a powerful statement because it's a true statement if we really want to live up to our full promise. And that's why the overwhelming majority of the American people support it. 75% of our fellow Americans support the ERA. 38 states have ratified it, enough to make the ERA our 28th Amendment. And yet 100 years after the proposed amendment was first introduced to Congress, despite this broad support, the ratification of the necessary number of states, we have not yet made that part of our Constitution. And the results are painfully clear every day. My colleagues have talked about some of them. The persistent pay gap, which disadvantages not only women, but also the families that they support. Recent rulings by the Supreme Court on reproductive rights have shown that the lack of an explicit protection against gender discrimination puts women's fundamental rights at risk and on the chopping block. So this is the moment to finally get this done. I again want to thank Senator Cardin and Senator Murkowski for their efforts to move forward on this. I want to thank the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And as I close, I do want to say a few words about my friend and colleagues from Maryland's long-term fight for this, and applaud him for over a decade of working to make sure that we get the ERA across the finish line. It's been one and very important aspect, in fact, the cornerstone of many of his efforts here in the United States, but it's a reflection of his fights for civil rights, for women's rights, for racial rights, and for human rights around the world. And I want to thank him for his persistence on this and so many issues that call upon us to be what we say we are as Americans, people who believe in the equal dignity of every individual and the rights of every individual. So I want to thank my colleague. I want to thank him for teaming up with Senator Murkowski from Alaska and thank her for her efforts. I said at the beginning that we have been defined as an American story by our struggle to make good on that original promise, the idea of equal rights. Many people have tried to interpret it different ways, but I think we all understand that at the end of the day, the North Star is equal rights, means equal rights for everybody, not just equal rights for some people over here, because that's not equal rights. And that's as simple as what brings us here to the floor. And I want to thank my colleague again from Maryland for keeping this fight going. I really hope my Republican colleagues will take this moment, despite what we expect, to enshrine that simple proposition into the Constitution of the United States. I yield the floor.